Tomorrow morning, the president wakes up, opens a laptop, and with one command creates enough money to wipe out all $39 trillion of US debt. Overnight, taxes crash, stocks moon, and your savings account quietly gets wrecked. Sounds amazing, right? Today, I'm going to show you why that fantasy turns into a nightmare and how real money printing is already changing your rent, your investments, and your future. Stay with me until the end because I'll show you a simple mental model to tell if the government is quietly taxing you through inflation, even when they promise not to raise your taxes. Let's start with the question everyone has but is afraid to ask. If we can type money into existence, why don't we just do more of it? Here's the wild part. In 2020, during COVID, the US really did something close to that. Congress passed the CARES Act, a stimulus package over $2.2 trillion, about 10% of the entire US economy at the time. That money funded checks, unemployment boosts, business loans, the works. On top of that, the Federal Reserve started buying massive amounts of government bonds, effectively creating new dollars to keep markets from freezing and to fund those rescue packages. This policy is called quantitative easing, QE for short. So if we did it once, trillions in relief, Fed buying debt, why not just keep doing it forever? Why not pay for healthcare, student loans, and the entire national debt the same way? To answer that, you need to know what money actually is and what gives it power in the first place. Okay, so what actually happens when we print more money? Think less magic cheat code and more too many dollars chasing the same stuff. Imagine a small town with 5 people and 5 loaves of bread. Each loaf costs $5, and each person has $5. Perfect balance. 5 people, 5 loaves, $25 total. Everyone gets 1 loaf. Now the government says, we want people to feel richer, and hands everyone another $5. Suddenly, there are $50 in town, but still just 5 loaves of bread. Everyone now wants 2 loaves, but there aren't enough. The baker sees people bidding against each other and raises the price to $10 a loaf. People still only walk away with 1 loaf each, but they now pay twice as much for the exact same bread. That's inflation. Prices rise because the total money went up faster than the amount of stuff to buy. Your income might not move, but your rent, groceries, and gas quietly drift higher. Now imagine that process going completely off the rails, prices doubling not every few years, but every day or even every few hours. That's hyperinflation, and real countries have been there. You're about to see how ugly it gets. Most people think money is backed by something, like gold, oil, GDP, like there's a vault somewhere with bars of gold for every dollar. That used to be true, but not anymore. In the early days, money was commodity money, things that had use on their own, like salt, livestock, or gold coins. Then we shifted to representative money, paper that promised you a certain amount of gold if you turned it in at the bank. The US followed that path, gold and silver coins, then the gold standard, and finally, in 1971, the dollar moved fully to fiat money, currency that has value not because it's backed by gold, but because we collectively believe it does, and the government enforces it as legal tender for taxes and debts. One of the reference videos calls this the Tinkerbell effect. Money keeps its magic as long as enough people believe in it. If we ever stop trusting that those green pieces of paper or digital balances will hold value, the spell breaks, fast. That trust is what protects your paycheck, your retirement account, and the roof over your head. Lose that, and it doesn't matter how many zeros sit in your bank app. They stop meaning anything. First stop, Weimar Germany after World War I. The government owed massive war reparations, the economy was wrecked, and they started printing money to cover bills and debts. By late 1923, prices were doubling every few hours. One of our reference videos gives a brutal example. A loaf of bread that cost 250 marks in January 1923 shot up to around 200 billion marks by November. People used wheelbarrows of cash to buy basic food. Savings built over decades were wiped out in months. Next, Zimbabwe in the 2000s. After land seizures, collapsing farm output, sanctions, and bad policy, the government tried to finance its spending by printing money. By 2008, annual inflation is estimated at around 89.7 sextillion%. That's an 8 with 20 zeros after it. Prices could double in a day or even hours. The central bank printed $100 trillion bills that were basically worthless. People needed huge stacks of notes just to buy eggs. Eventually, Zimbabwe abandoned its currency and started using foreign currencies like the US dollar instead. Then there's Venezuela. Huge oil reserves, heavy dependence on oil money, price controls, and massive subsidies made life feel affordable until oil prices crashed and the government chose printing money instead of cutting spending or reforming the economy. Hyperinflation followed, and the local currency became so worthless that people used banknotes for crafts or threw them away. Why am I showing you worst-case horror stories? Because they prove a scary truth. Governments can keep printing until people stop trusting the money. Once that happens, the crash is psychological and fast. In a minute, we'll pull this back to the US and why that matters for your savings right now.
Here's the twist. The US absolutely has been printing huge amounts of money, just not with physical printing presses alone and not without limits. The key number to watch is M2 money supply: cash, checking, savings, and similar accounts. As of February 2026, M2 is around $22.7 trillion, up about 4.9% from a year earlier, and at a record high. It also recently passed its previous peak from March 2022. That's a ton of liquidity sloshing around the economy. One analysis of money supply growth notes that by late 2025, U.S. money supply was again expanding more than 4% year over year, after a period of contraction, and that nearly 29% of the total money stock had been created just since early 2020. That means a huge chunk of all existing dollars are very young dollars. And yet, we're not in Zimbabwe territory. As of March 2026, U.S. inflation is running about 3.3% over the last 12 months, higher than the Federal Reserve's 2% target, but nowhere near hyperinflation. In calendar 2025, inflation ran about 2.7%, after much higher readings in 2021-2022. Prices are still rising, but the explosion has cooled. So, no, America is not just mindlessly printing money and waiting to become the next Weimar Germany. But we are playing a very delicate game, keeping the system liquid enough to avoid crashes without letting inflation eat the middle class alive.
Let's come back to that opening fantasy: wiping out the national debt with a keystroke. As of early 2026, U.S. gross national debt is around $39 trillion, more than the entire annual output of the economy, which is roughly $30.8 trillion in nominal GDP. That's a debt-to-GDP ratio well above 100% and projected to keep climbing. Interest payments alone are approaching or exceeding $1 trillion a year. Why not just create 39 trillion new dollars and pay everyone back? Here's the problem. Those bonds are held by pension funds, foreign governments, insurance companies, U.S. banks, and regular Americans. People and institutions that trust the U.S. will pay back in real money, not monopoly money. If the U.S. suddenly monetized the entire debt, that is, printed enough money to pay everything off, you'd inject a tidal wave of new dollars into an economy that's not producing anywhere near that much extra stuff. Prices would spike as all that money chased the same goods and assets. Foreign creditors would see their dollar assets melt in real value and start dumping U.S. bonds and even dollars themselves. The dollar's role as the world's reserve currency depends on trust that the U.S. isn't going to nuke its own money on a whim. And here's the punch in the gut. Ordinary Americans would get hit hardest. Your paycheck and bank balance are priced in dollars. If the government chooses hyper money printing, your wages won't adjust fast enough, but your grocery bill and rent will. That's how inflation acts like a stealth tax on savers and salary earners. So the US picks what seems like the lesser evil: carry a big, growing debt burden and manage it over time, instead of blowing up the currency that everything else is built on.
You might be thinking, wait, but didn't the Fed promise to buy unlimited treasury bonds during COVID? Isn't that just printing money in disguise? Good catch.
During the 2008 financial crisis and again in 2020, the Federal Reserve used quantitative easing. It bought huge amounts of government bonds and other assets, creating new reserves that didn't exist before. That injected cash into the financial system and helped fund giant relief packages like the CARES Act. The idea is that instead of mailing everyone bags of cash forever, the Fed buys bonds, lowers interest rates, and encourages banks and investors to lend and invest in the real economy: businesses, homes, jobs. That can stabilize things without immediately spiraling into runaway price increases, if they later slow or reverse it. And that's the catch. If they keep money too loose for too long, inflation eventually bites. After the COVID shock and massive stimulus, we saw U.S. inflation spike well above target, forcing the Fed to hike interest rates aggressively and start shrinking its balance sheet. That's the morning after of easy money. Think of it like a painkiller. In a crisis, pandemic, financial crash, you take a big dose to survive. But if you keep taking that same dose every day, you're not curing the disease, you're creating a new one.
Now, some economists argue we're still too scared of government spending and money creation. A school of thought called modern monetary theory, popularized by economist Stephanie Kelton in The Deficit Myth, says that a country like the US that issues its own currency can't really run out of money the way a household can. The real constraint is inflation, not the size of the deficit itself. MMT argues that as long as inflation is low and there's slack in the economy, unemployed workers, unused factories, the government can and should spend more, even if it means bigger deficits, to reach full employment and fund public goods. The proposed break is to cut spending or raise taxes when inflation picks up. Even many critics of MMT agree on one point: the government can always create more of its own currency. The disagreement is about politics and discipline. Will leaders actually slam the brakes when inflation starts to rise, or will they keep printing and keep promising until trust breaks? In a second, I'll give you a simple way to sanity check U.S. money creation yourself, no PhD required, so you can tell when the system is overheating long before the headlines hit.
Let's bring this all the way down to your life. As of now, prices in the U.S. are rising at about 3.3% year over year, while money supply is growing around 4 to 5% annually. That's not a crisis, but it's also not free money. If your savings account is paying you 1%, you're quietly losing buying power every year. At the same time, the government is carrying roughly $39 trillion in debt, with interest costs heading toward $1 trillion a year as rates stay higher. That means future budgets will juggle Social Security, defense, healthcare, and a giant interest bill without the easy escape hatch of printing it all away. So here's your mental model to remember. If the money supply is growing faster than the real economy for a long time, expect more inflation or asset bubbles. If inflation is rising and politicians are still promising endless new spending without offsets, expect that stealth tax on savers to grow. If trust in the currency or in U.S. debt ever seriously cracks, that's when printing stops being policy and starts becoming panic. The good news is, understanding this puts you ahead of most people. You don't have to panic every time you hear trillions on the news, but you also don't have to swallow the fairy tale that governments can print your problems away for free. We don't print more money because money isn't just paper, it's trust. Break that trust and the system breaks with it. Protect your own future by paying attention not just to how much money is being spent, but to what you're actually getting for it, and how fast prices and money supply are really growing. If you found this helpful, share it with someone who still thinks the government should just print more money. And if you want a deep dive on how inflation quietly taxes your savings, subscribe, because that's exactly what we're breaking down next.